Hey, Tolerators, it's me, Natalie, with your before show updates on all things Team Tolerator. So, we are sitting on the January, February, March side of life. And what does that look like? Well, it looks like the misogyny meltdown over on Patreon is well underway. That is a new series and show that I am producing for Patreon members only because there is a lot of scripting and a lot of vulnerability going on. I've already sang a song, I've already produced a skit, I'm already writing comedy. So take a chance on the misogyny meltdown and the way that To All the Men I've Tolerated Before is expanding and evolving with the link in the show notes. For January, we celebrated the Misogynist of the Year award ceremony. For February, we are focusing on the concept of love and self love being part of the resistance. And in March, why, yes, we're still going to do seasonal things with celebrating International Women's Month. And all of that will be wrapped up into our new variety show, Misogyny Meltdown. I cannot wait for you to check it out. Hey, Tolerators, this is To All the Men I've Tolerated Before with Natalie Katona, your weekly look at everyday misogyny. I have a new friend today. There have been a lot of new friends for To All the Men I've Tolerated Before in 2024. Kristen is a pop culture critic, a royal watcher, and health journalist. She hosts The Daily Veil, a podcast that dissects and laughs at the tabloid news. And also the best person that I have met so far through our friend Chris DeRosa.
Oh, stop it. Because Kristen knows all the best
Knows
people.
all the best people. And today we are finally doing the episode I've been secretly craving to do. We're going to talk about misogyny and how it relates to the royal family. Thank you so much for this lovely opportunity.
Oh my gosh, I am so excited to talk about this. And honestly, I think you are the first podcast host who's invited me on to talk exclusively about this topic. I've talked a lot about racism, I've talked a lot about classism, I've talked about colonialism, but misogyny is real with these people. And I'm so excited to talk about it with you because you're so smart and funny and you're just the best person to have this conversation with. So thank you
Oh
for
my
inviting me.
goodness, thank you. I find that so hard to believe that no one has ever wanted to at least take one look at this when they're inviting you onto a show because every episode I've listened to, The Daily Fail, you have made a point or your co-host has made a point to be like, this is something that they do to women with like a capitalized W.
Yes, and I'm not saying misogyny doesn't come up in various conversations. I'm saying the fact that that is the main reason we're having this conversation, and I love it. I love that that's what you want to talk about today.
Well, let's have the listeners get to know you a little bit more. Could you give us a background on how one becomes a royal watcher? Because I know that I am a royal watcher, but I'm not a very official royal watcher.
It's hard to be somebody who lives in our world or who engages with pop culture. It's hard to be that kind of person and not have a little bit of exposure to the royals. It's kind of like I see it similarly to the Kardashians. Whether you want to or not, you're keeping up with them if you follow pop culture, right? I keep up with the Kardashians whether I want to or not. And I kind of see the royals the same way. If you like pop culture in any way, you can't look at a magazine cover, a blog, a Twitter feed, Instagram without getting some sort of idea of what's happening with them. Bits and pieces of this scandal or that scandal. We as a society, even those who don't follow pop culture, we have ideas of who the good guys and the bad guys are. We know who the queen is. We know who Camilla is. We know who Diana is. We know who the major players are, right? And I definitely grew up in a household that followed those things. My mom was an Anglophile. My nana read the tabloids. I learned to read with the help of the National Enquirer and Star as a little kid. And the very first time as a wee little kid I even saw a wedding, um, cartoon, live action, real life or otherwise, was watching Princess Di and Charles get married on TV. Or I should say recaps of it, because I don't think I was up at like 2 in the morning watching that as a little kid. But so the Royals were always kind of in the backdrop of my life. And I continued to follow them the older I got. I did a study abroad in England at one point, and I got to see the last royal engagement in which Princess Di and Charles attended together. That was the 50th anniversary of VJ Day. And I followed them closely just as a hobby, along with all the other celebrities I watched. And then when I was working in public radio, I was a pop culture producer, and I just happened to be, there at the same time when William and Kate got engaged. And I was fortunate enough to cover all the street parties that were happening in New York City in celebration of their marriage. And from there, I just continued covering them here and there. And then when Meghan and Harry got engaged, I ended up hosting a podcast called When Meghan Met Harry. And that podcast began right around the time they got engaged. And it culminated with my co host and I actually attending their wedding in Windsor. And that show really resulted in me being, more regularly on the scene as a royal watcher. And ever since that podcast, I've been many times, more times than I can count, on the BBC, the CBC, CNN, many print outlets. I've been in maybe somewhere between a half a dozen and a dozen documentaries at this point on TLC, on different networks, NBC, and so on. So I probably give somewhere between, oh gosh, during a really busy year, at least 50 interviews a year now about the Royals.
I am just so geeked because it's so funny because my mom had to explain to me in my 20s that I do not, in fact, have memories of Charles and Diana's wedding. Like, I believe that I have memories. Like, I also was very involved. And she goes, no, you've just always have been watching like VH1's I Love the 70s or I Love the 80s. And she goes, you watch a lot of pop culture focused TV. Therefore, you believe you've seen these things and are an expert. She did let me have Diana's funeral. She goes, you probably do have memories from when Princess Diana died. And then in college, we did stay up till 3 a.m. for William and Kate's wedding. And we went to our senior banquet was that night. And we went to senior banquet in full like formal wear and fascinators. And when people
Yes.
and when
Nice.
people were like, for why? And I was like, it is the royal wedding day, and this is just a blip on what I have to be involved in today.
It was a big deal at the time. I mean, I think a lot of people forget because Kate does walk the line. She's very conventional. You know, she doesn't make waves. She's the most I mean this in not an insulting way. I don't mean it that way. But she's the least controversial princess they ever could have hoped for, right? And I think we forget that at the time it was a big deal. She technically, while being filthy rich, was not technically aristocracy. She was the first college educated future queen. It was a big deal at the time. And it was the closest we had seen, really, to this is kind of like a Cinderella story. Because even though the press liked to present Diana as if she was a Cinderella story, she was aristocracy. She was, kind of related to the royals already. She was a very, very distant cousin of all of them anyway. And whereas Kate, she was, quote, middle class. Yes, a multimillionaire, but still, not old money and so on. And it was a big deal that she was university educated.
I know that I've talked about this before on another podcast where we were covering the Tudors, but I believe that Diana was a direct descendant or at least a cousin of Anne Boleyn. Am I getting that correct? Correct?
I think that might be right. I forget how far back everybody goes and who's exactly related to who. But yes, and one thing I also love, just as a side note, not everybody knows this, but Princess Di's grandmother was an American. She was a dollar bride, or what do they call them? A dollar princess. I'm not sure if you know that term, but she was somebody who was her grandmother was part of the old money set. Oh, I'm sorry, it might be her great grandmother. The uh, Her family was part of the new money set in the U.S. You know, like the Vanderbilts, the Fisks, all of that new money, and a lot of those people who were trying to social climb the new money and weren't being accepted by the old money in the States, like the Astors, they would marry off their daughters to people who were titled in the UK. And that way they could get some sort of prestige, like, oh, I'm titled. And then these old lords and dukes that they would marry, just because they lived a life of leisure and never made money themselves, they needed that influx of money to keep their castles afloat and so on and to keep their lifestyles going. So Princess Di descended from some, some of that new money from the US. She is part
Oh my
American.
goodness. I've never known that. Even with the release of that new Prime show, The Buccaneers, and when they're that's the whole plot of the show is English aristocracy coming over to get American brides. That
Mhm.
is never
Yep,
that's
yep.
fascinating. Thank you so much for that little tidbit.
Yes, I think that sometimes the Brits wonder, like, oh, why do Americans even care about all of this stuff? And it's like, well, we are all related to each other. We all intermarry each other. Yes, we kicked you out of the US, all of you. But we still, we're still related. We're still cousins.
Well, and it is you use the term Cinderella when you're a little girl growing up in America, and if you were especially a millennial little girl growing up in America, my sister jokes that everyone goes through these 3 phases, and I just never dropped them. She goes, she will say, she goes, "Every young girl had one of these phases. They had a Tudor phase, they had a Princess Di phase, and they had a Greek mythology phase. You grabbed onto all 3, and then you made them your entire personality." And I was like, yeah, I did, and thank you." But
It's hard to avoid. It's really presented to us from a very young age as a fantasy that we as girls should latch on to,
it was the
right?
closest thing we had to Disney livelihood, and but then you become a woman in your 30s and you turn on Netflix and you go, "I don't remember Charles being that good looking, and I doubt he was that kind or romantic."
You know, when I think of Charles, I think of a guy who, you know, he was in his 30s and he got married to a girl who was, just a few days into being 20 years old. When they got engaged, she was a teenager. They'd only gone out on maybe somewhere between half a dozen and a dozen dates at that point. They got engaged when she was a teenager and he was in his 30s, and then they got married. And I think, you know what? If I had anybody in my life who was a 19-year-old girl and a 32-year-old dude was dating her, I'd be like, I don't know about that. I don't know if this is the great romance. You're not old enough to go to a bar. In England, you are. You're old enough to go to a bar when you're 19, but in a lot of the world, you're not. And you're essentially a kid. Like last year, you were in high school, right? Um, and so I have a personal issue with that. I know other people are like, oh, it's only like 13 years difference, but to me, it's like, mm, that's that's a big age
I
difference.
always get hung up on the math because a 13-year age difference might not be the biggest thing in the world when you're 27. But when you're 19 and that's when your relationship starts, then I'm like, okay, but then your 20s are robbed of you honing a personality and gaining speed towards what you would actually want and what your values are going to be because now you're a wife and you're a wife in the royal family. And I'm sure that she had her own pressures in her own family about what, the roles in her life were going to be. But to then add on, I couldn't imagine being a queen at 20. I'll just say it. Like,
Yeah, on the world stage, being probably the most photographed woman in the world at the time. And you're literally not old enough to rent a car yet for another 5 years. And oh gosh, now you're a mom too. Oh, now you're a mom again. And all of that happening with all of this weight on your shoulders to be presenting what Britishness is to the world, to be representing the monarchy, to be representing history as well as fairy tale. It's a lot of work to do all of that and to do it while you're married to a man who's actually not even in love with you, but in love with somebody else. It just sounds terrible. It's a terrible thing. It's like the worst version of, I'm not sure if this happened to you, but a lot of women, including myself, we dated duds when we were teenagers, right? We dated guys who didn't treat us well. We put up with a lot of stuff because, oh, we should just try harder. I should be a nice girl. Oh, a boyfriend's a great thing to have. What can I do to make this work? And meanwhile, the guy's being a jerk, or maybe he's running around on us. And she is doing that only on the world stage in one of the oldest institutions in the world. So I think, oh my God, she's like my whole college year, my whole college life experience times a gazillion. And it's not something that she can just run away from or dump that guy or just bitch to whoever she wants to about how shitty it is, because anytime she opens her mouth, she might be, recorded. Somebody might be spying on her. She has to be careful about who she, you know, vents to or seeks advice from. It's not as simple as the rest of us when we're that age in university.
Yeah, I call that effect of dating the dud that's the closest one to you, the arm's length effect, where it's like, "Oh, why have you been dating him so long?" And it's like, "Well, he's right there." Like, I don't even have to leave the room to try and find someone else because look, there he is. And it does happen a lot when you're a teenager because you're sitting in desks in rows near one another. It's all about proximity.
Yes. Yeah. It's proximity. And it's also that we haven't learned how to stand up for ourselves yet. We also haven't learned what we are worthy of necessarily. I think that there is a point when we're all young children and we're told, a lot of us, if we're lucky, that, oh, you can do anything, you can do it, you're capable, just try harder. And then we enter adolescence and that gradually starts getting beaten out of us. No, you're too ugly. No, you're too this, you're too that. You're not enough of this. And it starts to get beaten out of us, and products get sold to us to fix things that are supposedly wrong with us. We're supposedly the wrong size. Our skin is wrong. Our hair is wrong. Everything's wrong with us. We're too loud or we're too quiet. We're too this, we're too that. And I think it becomes easy for us to not know our worth because that little kid self-worth that, the 3-year-old who jumps off the top of the stairs and yells, I can do it, look at me fly. That little kid has been beaten down and beaten to death. And so by the time we do start dating, it's easy to think, oh, I'm lucky just to have someone, even if he treats me like crap.
That's very well said and something that has been discussed on this podcast almost every episode. It's amazing how we'll be talking about something that you would think has nothing to do with dating. It could be women's health care or something, and it all relates back to, well, I never pushed against the doctor because I haven't been trained to push against people and to ask for what I want. And then an anecdote comes up about your dating life or the way that someone talked to you as a kid. And when Diana did arrive at the age or at the bravery or the maturity to push back, she wasn't pushing back against her in laws. She was pushing against the institution and begging reporters to let her sons walk into their first day of school without being bothered.
The consequences of, you know, putting up with or not knowing her worth uh, were enormous. And, that I'm not trying to minimize what the rest of us went through when we were teenagers or in our early 20s, because a lot of us went through just absolutely terrible, reprehensible things. But she was going through it while people were profiting off of it and eating it up. And millions of dollars were being made with each photograph that was being taken of her. It was not on a level that most of us deal with, where what we're dealing with is also commodified in that way.
And when you start to put up these defense mechanisms like believing that your phone is being tapped or being really choosy about who you're sharing things with or not writing anything down or not sharing things with people. It's another, and I think we saw this with Britney Spears' memoir and her father, that also the way that you've become almost paranoid about your own existence and what is actually going on around you becomes another tool in the tool belt that they use to discredit you, to be like, well, if you were smiling more or warmer or whatever, Charles would be happy to be on this yacht with you.
Hmm. Yeah. And I think it's interesting you brought up the word paranoia because paranoia to me usually means that it's something that's in your head and it's not based in real fact or doesn't have a foundation. But in both Britney Spears' case and Diana's case, it was not paranoia. They were actually being bugged at all times. They were actually being surveilled. They actually had invasions of privacy as part of their daily lives. I mean, I just think about the fact that you aren't even, necessarily in your own house alone ever if you are Diana. Somebody's always coming in to change the sheets or draw the curtains or this or that. Who's overhearing just very simple things like you singing to yourself in the shower in the morning? You don't have any privacy ever in your own home. Mind you, it's a castle, but it's still your home,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah. And the castle wasn't big enough for her to escape people overhearing things or misinterpreting things. That's a very good point. I should have said, I should come up with a term for it, like assumed paranoia or weaponized paranoia or something like that. Because you're right. It is, we use the term paranoia and it's like, but don't even worry, that's not even happening. You're being paranoid. And they were actually being victimized by their own circumstances. When it comes to the royal family and reporting on them or watching over them, there there's no way to sugarcoat that there is a line drawn about the protections that are allowed to the men, the male members of the royal family, that aren't always allowed to the female members of the royal family.
You know, that's an interesting um, point when I think of, for example, Prince Andrew. Um, Prince Andrew, who we have to be careful about how we talk about him on certain outlets. When I'm on British outlets, for example, I referred to him as a person of interest in the Jeffrey Epstein case, and they told me they couldn't use that term there, or they would be the victims of a lawsuit. That outlet. So it's really interesting how the UK outlets deal with Prince Andrew because they can be sued by the royal family at any time over using terms that we in the US use freely. Person of interest, I didn't say he absolutely raped teenagers. I didn't say he absolutely did that. I said he's a person of interest in that case. So I think it's interesting that as far as how he has been protected, it includes by the press in the UK also, as well as his family. And to go back to how his family has protected him, who paid for the Virginia Jeffrey case to be settled? Who paid those millions of dollars? Well, it was the royal family paid for it, right? His mother, because uh, that case was conveniently made to go away with money. And I, I know some people would say, oh, well, the queen, that was her money. She can do what she wants to with the money, but she chose to protect him with the money. And is the money ever 100% the royal family's when the royal family has made so much money pillaging, colonizing, being a landlord, not paying taxes? Charles, for example, did not have to pay any inheritance tax after his mother died. And the rest of us, we have to pay inheritance tax. If any of us are fortunate enough to inherit something when a parent dies, it's not a given. A lot of us will never inherit anything when a parent dies. But when we do, more often than not, we're not exempt like Charles is from paying taxes on those inheritances. Anywho, to go back to my point, somebody paid to make that case go away. And that somebody was the queen, and indirectly, that was the public that paid to have that case go away. And so I think that's an unfair use of money because did the public really want that case to just go away? Did the taxpayers really want that just to disappear? All the places that have been pillaged or colonized or been part of the slave trade, did they want that case to just disappear? I, I would say most of us didn't. The US was once a colony, and most people I know in the US think it's reprehensible that the royal family just paid to make that go away. They paid to protect Andrew.
Yeah. Well, and the when it comes to the press in England is known to be like the press with a capital P and an exclamation point at the end to where, they're constantly on top of the royal family, on top of celebrities in England, writing at all times, which we do it too. But I remember growing up knowing that there was a difference between our tabloids and their tabloids and what was allowed from their tabloids. So for him to have just kind of a blanket protection from the press, that says a lot. And I don't believe I can think of an example where someone else in the royal family has been offered that. And maybe it's because my history is escaping me, but I can just think of Queen Elizabeth's sister, Margaret, how and her reputation and exactly what her reputation was. And they had all of the money in the world to make sure that whatever Margaret was doing socially, even if she was loud about it, they could have put it to bed because they've put other things to bed that have been enlightened. And they just went, well, Margaret should know better and maybe she'll behave.
She drank, she partied, she chased the wrong men. Yeah, there was definitely that reputation that was out there. To bring it to more modern times, what have they done to protect Meghan Markle? I mean, look at the plethora of news stories about Meghan Markle from very early on, from the time the engagement was first announced, from the time there were rumors of Harry and Meghan first dating. I mean, there was that famous Sarah Vine Daily News headline that said that she had a niggling feeling about her. There were a lot of dog whistle headlines. There were headlines about her being straight out of Compton. There were attempts to link her to jihadists in various stories in the tabloid press. I could go on and on and on. There's a gazillion examples. Also, many, many stories that deliberately pit her against Kate Middleton, almost always with the slant that Meghan Markle was breaking protocol for doing something that they celebrated Kate doing separately. And I was part of an in-depth piece comparing side-by-side headlines in Insider, looking at that. Eventually, there was a much bigger story in, I believe it was BuzzFeed, that just showed like 100 side-by-side headlines, like, look at Meghan Markle, who is trying to destroy the climate. It was about drought, climate change, a lot of other things because of her beloved avocados. And then side by side, there was a story about Kate Middleton and how William loves her so much that it's her favorite pregnancy treat and he always brings her avocados. And so there were just like all of these stories that were obviously showing that the press was choosing sides that we presented in that piece. And we could put out another piece like that every 6 months and never run out of headlines showing how Meghan Markle is terrible and how Kate is good and wholesome. Kate is the right kind of princess. Meghan is the wrong kind of princess. And so, a lot of the misogyny is, they protect men more than women, but they also protect certain women in the institution more than other women. So there's that to be
Oh,
considered as
yeah,
well.
because we go round and round talking about how you can't have one oppression without looking to your right and going, wait, is that also classism or racism or any of ageism over there? Oh, look, it is right there. They've all been partying together.
Yes. Oh, yeah. They love having that party. It's the worst party in the whole
It's the
world.
worst party in the world. And, Megan there are people who will talk to me about Meghan Merkel like she has personally come over to their home and, like, peed all over the floor or something, and I'm like, "At what point Did you do an in-depth analysis on Meghan Markle and decided that she was at fault here and also trying to take down a monarchy that we technically have no part in, but you're really upset about that? I go, she doesn't really have the time to take down a monarchy or the resources.
No, she's just one person. She's just one person. And it's amazing how much she gets blamed for, and how Harry is essentially either presented as a hostage in this situation, or just invisible, or they let him off the hook. And when I say let him off the hook, he himself has said, it was my decision to step back from being a senior royal. I was not stepping back from my family. I was stepping back from the family job, okay, the family business. And that was my choice to step back from the family business, as I am the one who was born into the family business. I was not pressured to do this. This was a decision I made. And it does not seem to matter how many times he has said that was his decision. Somehow, Meghan is a mastermind who has forced him into this life. And he is somebody who, despite being almost 40 years old, has no free will,
Oh, and
apparently.
she wrote the statement for him and and
Oh, yes. And he's too dim to think for himself. And yeah, I mean, all of this stuff. Like, you know what? I think you're giving her a little too much credit for
well,
this.
and it's never too much credit, like, she's a great mom, or she's been able to raise 2 kids during all of this, or
She's done a great job as a self-made businesswoman. Yeah, there are all these like, oh, look at all the charitable work that she did long before she ever even met Harry. None of that gets celebrated as too much.
no.
No.
They it's always she's exhausted Harry to the point where he won't even go over there for Christmas because he is exhausted, and that plays a lot into family dynamics that I see over here. I was shocked and well into my 20s the first time a woman told me, "Oh, no, I'm not going over there because I really don't have a relationship with my in-laws. My husband knows exactly why and what they've said about me, or to other family members that have, ratted them out, and I'm done, but I allow them to have a relationship with my child because I don't believe she's old enough to make that decision yet." And I thought, you can just not have a relationship with people, even though you know them through family or
Hmm.
marriage or jobs or any of it. She went, "You sure can."
That's true. And obviously, in Harry's case, he was just over in the UK seeing his father after his cancer diagnosis. Uh, he is still capable of getting on a plane when he wants to and doing what he feels like. She is not holding him prisoner in any way. And if she doesn't want to spend time with them, that's also within her rights. And the same would be true on the flip side. If for some reason there was something happening where Harry no longer wanted to spend time with any of Meghan's family, that would also be allowed. We are free agents. We are humans who are allowed to make those decisions for ourselves of who makes us feel safe, who doesn't make us feel safe, who hurts us, and how much distance or closeness we want to have with people, right?
I think that one of the things that always touched me most about when they were covering Megan early on in the marriage, or maybe the engagement, was how they would talk about her family. Like the royal family in it of itself is a very complicated family that has had a lot of complicated things happen to them. And they'd be like,
Hmm.
oh, these clout chasers in Megan's family. People are just coming out of the woodwork now that Megan might be close to royalty. And it's like, well, that's happened before.
And as far as the clout chasers in Meghan's family, the tabloid press has been instrumental in that. They courted Meghan's dad, who fell into the trap and chose never to leave the trap of being paid off for, family photos of his daughter, or to be photographed reading guidebooks to England were like the first ones that he was photographed, planning to go to the wedding and so on. And the tabloid press, we cannot underestimate how powerful they are. There's something called the Royal Rota, which is the press pool that works closely with the royal family. They get invited to special events. They are tipped off on certain stories, they work in cooperation with the family as an extension of their PR team, essentially. Certain members of the royal family or of certain houses will tattle on other members of the royal family in order to get attention off of them. And this is something that's been well understood for a very long time. It's something that Harry explains in great detail in his book Spare. But, Harry's book is not the only source that explains how this works. This is something that's well understood by people who've been part of the Rota over the years and so on. Omid Scobie, who is a royal journalist, has also written extensively about it. Lots of journalists have written about the Royal Rota. It's well understood. And so, the Royal Rota, in exchange for access to the royal family, they write certain stories that make the royal family proud or happy, or that, they cooperate with certain members of the family. And this relationship is so tight and so important that even Camilla, her head of PR, is a former editor of the Daily Mail. This is not something that they just work with. It's something that they actually hire people from to help them to spin things even
It's
better.
like all of those crime shows where they are like, "We'll just hire the hacker to teach us how to hack and to
Yes.
and to catch all the hackers. We'll just make them on our side."
Yes. Exactly.
A big
Exactly.
theme on the show is that sometimes misogyny is so subtle and so everyday that because you're living within it, you don't actually realize that that misogyny is so ingrained in an institution and it's so normalized and lasting that, again, you're just living and not, and one day you'll just tilt your head and go, huh, I don't know if that's how I should have been treated during my American history class. What kind of things within a royal structure or a noble family structure allow misogyny to just be kind of naturally accepted and bred within the royal family or community? I'm thinking of how important male heirs used to be.
Yeah. And that was up until very, very, very recently. William and Kate, uh, they decided, along with the rest of the family, when they were expecting, I think it's when they were expecting George, their first, or maybe it was when they were expecting their second, when they were expecting Charlotte, that they no longer wanted the line of succession to go from male to male to male. And they wanted it to be birth order, regardless of sex or gender. And so that was very recent. Charlotte's not even 10 years old. This is very, very recent. This is well within our adult lifetimes that this change happened. This is very new. But line of succession up until, very recently was males. And the fact that the queen ended up being the queen was only because all the other male options were exhausted at that point. And things kind of went out of order when Wallace Simpson and Edward fell in love and, he abdicated. So then little Princess Elizabeth's father, George, ended up being the king. And then when he died, oh no, he only has two daughters. He doesn't have any sons. Oh no, what's going to happen now? Well, one of the daughters has to be on the throne now. And it's only because, he had no boys, God forbid. And that's how that happened for pretty much all of the history of the royal family. You only end up with the queen when you run out of boys. So things have only changed recently. So, yeah, that's an excellent example of how it's built into the system. The misogyny is built into the
I
system.
couldn't help but laugh so hard whenever on that silly Netflix show, The Crown, Queen Elizabeth would get so adamant that no one was allowed to get a divorce. Even Anne, who was pretty calm compared to everyone else. No divorces. She's like, we are the head of the Church of England. We are the closest thing that our people have to God Himself. And you're trying to get divorced. And I would just laugh and go, because that's what King Henry was all about when it came to the Church of England, making sure that
Oh,
marriage
yeah.
was sanctioned and holy and lasting. That was Henry's whole deal.
Oh, he loved the sanctity of marriage. He loved it so much he beheaded it over and over again. Yeah.
And I would just laugh because and I would say something completely rude and crass and go, "Your great-grandfather formed the Church of England because he was sick." I'll say it the nice way. He was sick of, like, not getting past third base. Like, he was truly bored of not getting past third base with Anne Boleyn. I that's how it's been depicted to me. Maybe no one caught you up on it, but even the idea of I think there's so much more weight to be had when it comes to who's allowed to get divorced and who isn't, when it comes to the weight of an unhappy marriage on a woman within that marriage and whether or not she's allowed to leave because there's so much already stacked against you when it comes to what's expected of you.
Yeah, well, why don't you just be happy that you married into this family and you know, the way it is with old money, maybe he has a mistress on the side and you can do things that you care about like gardening. Well, he does that, or maybe you can even have your own dalliances with a polo instructor or whatnot. But, just settle for what you're settling for and keep it quiet, ladies. Don't get upset about men being men. Boys will be boys. You know the way they are, right?
Yeah. Don't worry about what they're doing in that hunting lodge. They're with the foxes. It's fine.
They definitely are with the foxes.
They're
They
taking
sure
care
are.
of the dogs in the house. But yeah, it never failed to make me laugh. And but it's really just like a dark and sinister thought to think of how heavy that was for Queen Elizabeth to be the head of the church, that she wasn't willing to and it could have just been her personality, but she wasn't really allowing herself to budge or slide or do anything that would bring bad press or bad reputations or anything to anyone, and she carried that.
Yeah. She was very much about stability. And in many ways, she excelled at that whole idea of stability. I mean, I think about the queen as being an icon and a force and something that almost seemed unmovable that was here for not just our lifetimes, but our parents' lifetimes, our grandparents' lifetimes. She was the queen for as long as most humans on Earth have been alive, which is phenomenal to think about. She made one of the first transatlantic phone calls ever made. And by the time she was dying, she was doing Zoom calls with her grandkids around the world. It's just amazing to think of how much she was just there no matter what. She was like an institution in and of herself.
Yeah. And I just wonder if when it comes down to it, if she knew deep down in her soul, I'm not afforded the wiggle room that those who came before me were allowed. Like I as queen, it does feel like that was just a heavy weight on her and maybe not so much on Margaret due to her party lifestyle. But yeah, she really did. You could tell that she carried that every day and she was very good at it.
She was great at it. One of my favorite stories is from Michelle Obama's memoir, talking about how she accidentally laid hands on the queen. She hugged her and laughed and she later on was told she broke protocol and she's like, I'm sorry, she's so disarming and funny. The queen is just a joy to hang out with. She's such good company. She can bring anyone out of their shell and make them feel seen. And I accidentally fell for it, hook, line, and sinker. And before you know it, I'm hugging the queen because she's such a delight. And Michelle Obama, the way she writes about it, I'm like, wow, the queen had skills. The fact that she could be that disarming with anybody. I really take my hat off to her for that. And I wish I had that same skill set. She must be, when she was alive, I can imagine her walking into any room and just being a delight, talking to complete strangers, having fun. She had it. She knew how to do it. And I think that's fantastic. I also think that as far as her having to be so good at it, part of it was she was extremely young and she was a woman when she came into it, to get back to the misogyny issue. She had to do it very well as a woman, and she had to do it very well as somebody who was so young. And I mean, how many of us in our early 20s are told you're going to have this job for the rest of your life. Most of us switch jobs, at least I was told when I was in college, that I would be the first generation that would have an average of 8 jobs in my life, which, by the way, it's been way more than 8 jobs. It's been like, I don't know, 20 or 30. I've had so many jobs. So she, at a very young age, when a lot of people are just graduating college, was essentially being told, now it's your time to take over the family business and you can never leave this business. This is your job. You can leave it by stepping down, but what would that really say about you and the institution if you chose to step down, right? And so, she could have stepped down, but she couldn't really step down, you know? And she was doing it at such a young age. And we all know that the world doesn't necessarily treat young women with a great deal of seriousness or respect, right? We see it throughout history. We see it nowadays. I just think of young female politicians in the US and how they get treated. AOC from New York is one example. They are frequently dismissed. And even if we're not politicians, young women tend to be treated more dismissively than men of any age, including young
I think
women.
that part of the delight is all of those corgis. Like, she really did build up a dog army to be like, I'm going to disarm people into being charmed by me because a dog is going to run up on them. Before I get on another tangent, is there anything, because you were so excited to talk about misogyny within the royal family, is there one thing that when you think about misogyny in the royal family, you think, this is the thing I wish we talked about more? It could be a story, it could be a person, it could be a pattern, but anything that would excite you that I'm not covering.
It could be the very fact that most of the women in the royal family have only one job, which is to produce an heir. You are essentially a breed horse,
Hmm.
a broodmare. I'm not sure what the best term is for it, but your job is almost inhumane as a woman. And I, I have never been able to get over that. That's your job. Produce an heir, produce a spare, and then put on a smiling face and cut some ribbons and wave. But that's very secondary. Whether or not you actually do those things, it doesn't matter as much. I mean, I look at the first family, I look at the royal family of Monaco, for example. Albert, who has knocked up women all over the place. Anywhere he can put his dick, he puts it. And I'm not here to slut shame him for that. But, some of the children he has produced have not been white and they have not been legitimate. And because of that, they can never be an heir. And he has the woman that he has twins with, who, after producing the twins, has almost never been seen from again. But she is his wife, and she is white, and she is legally the mother of the future heirs to the throne. And because of that, because she produced those kids, that's enough. It doesn't matter that she's invisible and doesn't do any of the other royal duties. It's fine, because a woman's job in marrying into the royal family primarily is to just be there for your uterus and your eggs and your vagina, the whole thing, whatever. To do that thing, and then whether you do anything else after that, they'll probably say bad things about you if you don't do anything beyond that. But your job is
Well,
done.
and also anything else you're doing is just seen at, it's not your life's work, it's your hobby. So when Diana was so involved with AIDS relief and AIDS research and everything, it was always like, isn't that nice that Diana found time for this like little hobby she does at the hospitals? And I'm like, well, she's she spends a lot of time and money visiting sick kids. Like, I don't think it's going to the movies. I'm going to the movies later on, and I would never talk about it in the same way that I would talk about Diana doing all of that charity work.
She was doing a lot of it after hours and doing it off the clock too, which famously her guards have said, yeah, they snuck her in to hospitals, to AIDS wards with, in secret because they didn't want the cameras there. She wasn't doing it as a PR op. She did it as a PR op a few times because she wanted to draw attention to this cause, but more often than not, she was sneaking into these places because it mattered to her, because it was meaningful work, and because she didn't want to just be there for the cameras. She wanted to be there for the patients themselves. And to me, that says, this is something that I'm passionate about. This is important work for me beyond the cameras. And so I agree with you. We can't underestimate how important that is. And I see us doing it. I shouldn't say us. I see the press doing it all the time. Also with Meghan Markle's work too. She has done a lot of work with, one of her first jobs was working on the victims of the Grenfell fire on a cookbook. This is a fire in a low income housing development in the UK that killed hundreds of people. And a lot of people who were already living on the margins were injured, killed, or left homeless because of this fire. And uh, she worked hard on a cookbook with some of the surviving women that included recipes from their homelands, family recipes, and so on. Uh, and this was a fundraising cookbook and also a way to draw attention to the victims and so on. And she did this, plus created a fashion line for low income women that helped raise money for getting women back to work and so on. That there were all these different charitable things that Meghan did when she was a member of the royal family. And she got accused of being opportunistic or trying to make it all about herself. There were stories written about her being a workaholic tyrant, an angry black woman, too demanding, and so on. So I think it's interesting that when a woman in the royal family tries to do something outside of just cutting the ribbons or having the babies, it's frequently treated either as you said, just a hobby. Isn't that cute that she does that? Or treated as a problem. And I don't see that happening when men in the royal family do these things.
Well, because people think that when Megan is harassed in the press for doing something that is admirable and actually the definition of noble and loving and kind, that, oh, who cares? It's just tabloid trash. But I was just talking with another guest about this innate anxiety and fear I have of being overly kind to people, about being overly nice, about supporting people or being too excited for them. Because at the end of the day, it might just come back that I was trying to steal thunder from them or steal clout or things. And no one ever sat down and said, hey, Natalie, when you celebrate people, you get to compliment them once. And if that compliment is written too enthusiastically or too nicely, or you use too many exclamation points or adjectives, then it's cringy. And people really think that you're just trying to draw attention over to yourself and how nice you are. It's silencing, is what it is when the press does things like that to be like, look at Megan doing a whole charity thing just so she can be.
Making it all about
Yeah,
herself. Look at her do that.
it's
Yeah.
another way that they
Yeah.
silence us, and I don't think we give that enough credit, and I don't think we give it enough credit on how that continues to make us divided, and it's another one of those insidious tools that they do where it's like, well, if we tear Megan down because she's giving homeless women jobs, then some other women somewhere will also resent Megan, and that's a further divide.
And I just want to, you know, make a point here to say Diana wasn't perfect. Megan is not perfect. I'm not here to try and valorize them or make them sound like they're perfect. But because I think some people, when they hear me talk in the press, they're like, oh, you're just 100% Team Sussex. You love Diana no matter what. I'm not saying these people are flawless people in any way. What I'm saying is how the institution and how the press treat them is uh, just, it's patently unfair. They are presented as villains. Women are pitted against each other. And none of the ways that they are treated have anything to do with what they've actually done, good or bad, in the world.
Because I get the not with the royal family, just in general, I get that criticism too, where it's like, you find you're just really hard to find sympathy. You make it extremely hard to find sympathy or empathy for these men who are carrying out these oppressive systems. And I go, uh huh. It would, I go, uh huh. And I'll own it. Yep. The reason why I find it so hard to have as much empathy for Charles as I would have had for Diana, should the three of us be in the same room, is because at the end of the day, logically, my brain knows it'll work out for Charles and he'll still be okay. Like, you know?
Mhm. Yes. Yes, absolutely. And also, he was in the power position. Again, she was a teenager. He was in his 30s. He was part of a thousand-year-old machine of power, of oppression, uh, of money. And she, despite being from an aristocratic family, was not. She did not have all of those things that he had. And she also was a woman. And things tend to work out better for men than for women in our world,
And
unfortunately.
therefore, they get a little less sympathy and empathy from me, and I find that to be fine. I find you know, I don't even think they'll notice if my sympathy or empathy is cut into a half or a fourth for them. Like, I don't think they'll notice because someone else, mostly the press and people with more money than I, they'll take up the cause for them. There will always be someone who will try to convince me that Chris Pratt is a decent human, and that's fine. It's fine.
Yes. Enough people are giving him the benefit of the doubt. You don't have to. That's
You
okay.
know, it only took 3 episodes of Vanderpump Rules before we decided that Sandoval was actually feeling very badly, and Ariana is now a problem because she's successful. Like, it took us 3 whole episodes. I'm gonna go ahead and move us into our ending portion of the show where we kinda sum up everything and all of the heavy topics that we talked about today, and we learn and we move forward in joy. So, if you had one lesson that you've learned from your experiences being a royal watcher and your vast amount of other experiences, what is a lesson that you wish you could pass down to people? If you must know one thing, know this.
I was going to say, if you must know one thing, don't take it personally. And I'm saying this as a female, as an American, as a woman of color who is a royal watcher. I get a lot of hate. I've received threats to my physical person. I've received death threats for what I have said in the press in defense of Meghan Markle or in criticism of Prince Andrew. There are people out there who genuinely want me dead. And I have to keep in mind that, unfortunately, as much as I hate that, these are the consequences of being a woman who speaks up. And I don't want to be completely flippant about this because there's nothing fluffy or light or laughable about death threats. There's nothing that we should just like, ha ha ha. But also at the same time, I remind myself that this is something that I'm sure you and most women who speak up, we receive a lot of anger from people who don't like what we're saying. And I would rather make people angry with what I'm saying than to be silent because I don't think I could live with myself if I were silent, if I wasn't speaking up against racism or misogyny or classism or all of these other things. I I don't think I'd be happy with myself. So I'd rather make people angry and maybe make some people out there feel a little bit less alone and be able to live with myself and speak up. So that's a lesson that I would recommend that people take away from all of this.
You were the exact person I needed to talk to today in this exact, feelings moment because I ended my seasonal depression so angry and so in that taking it personally. If you were mad at Taylor Swift, you were mad at me. If you said something about Beyonce's outfit, you were talking about my outfit. I had gotten to the point where I was having a hard time separating whether or not women as a whole could be celebrated and could be supporting one another and that be 100% true and not immediately ruined by someone else's voice being in my head. And so I was having a hard time. And I would just tell people, I'd be like, I'm trying to do it, but I can't separate the people from the system. So if if someone is mad that someone got an award, I'm like, why aren't you screaming at the academy? Why are you screaming at the person who is also just a person living through this? And I was so angry. So I know that when I replayed that lesson that you just said, that was so beautifully well spoken. If I'm editing it soon and I'm still in a place where I'm like, wow, you really ended your holiday depression just so aware of how angry you are, I will probably cry, but please know it will be a very good release. Like the fact that I made it through
Good.
without crying.
Oh, it's okay to cry. Crying gets the sad out, as the song says. It's okay.
So I think my lesson might be that if it's a day where you need it to be 100% true that women can and will be celebrated and can and will support one another and be supported, then by God, turn off your phone and be like, today is the day that I feel that women and do the celebrating and do the supporting and do the changing of your algorithm. And I think I was just feeling so out of control about it. And I think that's why I could probably relate to royal women in a very smaller scale. I was just feeling so out of control. I forgot that I get to be a woman who celebrates other women, and I get to be a woman that supports other women, and I get to be a member of the world who makes sure that my feminism is intersectional and things like that. So I really appreciate that.
And you're giving something beautiful back to the world that people appreciate. So if you can continue to do it, the world is lucky. And if you have to take a break from it once in a while and just look at corgis on Instagram, that's okay too. That's okay. We have to do what we have to do sometimes to keep our fortitude, right? And sometimes that means taking a little break here and there and then going back out and fighting the
Yeah.
good fight, right?
And then we also end with a manifestation and a hope for what we would want in the future. And we tried to pare it down to maybe it would be in the future, I hope that royal women or the people that we were talking about and the oppressive system that we were talking about. So if you had one hope that you would like to offer up to the collective energy so that they also gain momentum and go, me too. I wish that would happen too. What would you manifest?
I would hope that not just royal women, but women in all parts of the universe, that we're not just fodder for comparison against each other. That's so much of the press about the royals, like who wore it better, and it's always the skinny one. Who's doing it right? Who's doing it wrong? Maybe we should just celebrate when people are doing something and stop caring so much about if she looks prettier than that woman doing it, or if she's doing it in a quote unquote better way than that woman. Just let's not compare each other anymore. We don't need to do that. We're doing the best we can. And comparison is not just the thief of joy, but it can also scare other women away from wanting to do anything in the first place. Let's not do that.
No, as a woman who has been scared from doing anything in the first place, I'm going to sign off on that too, to be like, you know, you can be the second place person in the competition and also be really happy for the first place person. And that's beautiful.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I love that. Absolutely.
So I would like it if we as a culture, as a country, as people walking this planet would throw away that beautiful lesson that Ricky Bobby played by Will Ferrell gave us and throw out the idea that if you're not first, you're last. Talladega Nights was a funny movie, but it was no way to build a life around. And I think we do get affected by the if you're not first, you're last mindset.
But we're all doing the best we can, and it's okay to not be first. That's fine.
It's okay to be happy for the person who did get to be first, or be happy for the person who fought like hell and got third, you know?
Hmm. Yeah. Or just to be happy for everybody who tried,
They're
you
all
know?
arbitrary, numbers. Kristen, thank you so much for being here. This was the best that this royal episode could have ever have been. And this has been like a big goal with an just a million times font on my outline of ideas that we should be doing. I'm like, we need to be doing the royals. They're so prevalent in our own culture that it has to be done. So thank you so much.
Oh, Natalie, this has been so much fun. Thank you so much for having me. It's been just great.
And make sure that all of our listeners know where they can connect with you and your work.
You can check out my podcast, The Daily Fail, where we lambast the stories from the world's most read English paper publication. I won't say the name of it. It rhymes with Daily Fail. But I guess I've already said the name of the publication during this conversation. So that's called the Daily Fail Podcast. And you can find all my other podcasts and all the other things I'm doing on Twitter at Kristen Meinzer or on my webpage, which is kristenmeinzer.com.
And it'll all be in the show notes, including all of the links to our Instagram at Men I've Tolerated Pod. There's a lot going on Patreon. It's for free. There are a lot of previews that you could be watching of the misogyny meltdown, where I take a lot of these topics that I've been very mature and calm about while being on this podcast and turn them into comedy and skits, because if SNL wasn't going to give me a writing job, because they're like, what if she wrote jokes about misogyny and people thought that misogyny was a big deal? I decided that I would just write my own jokes and make them for you. Go check all of that out. And remember, tolerators, you don't have to smile through anything you're tolerating, including a lot of people in the press making an example of one woman and how she is either the best thing or the worst thing in the world, and also taking on that identity yourself. Smiles are for joy.